On March 15, 1917, Nicholas II sat inside a railway carriage near Pskov and signed away the Russian throne. For more than 300 years, the Romanovs had survived palace coups, foreign invasions, assassinations, peasant rebellions, and wars that reached from the Baltic to the Pacific. Now the empire was collapsing faster than its ruler could reach the capital. Nicholas first considered passing the crown to his son, Alexei, then abdicated for both of them in favor of his brother Michael. The next day, Michael refused to accept the throne unless a future representative assembly asked him to. The Russian monarchy was effectively over. But the strange part is how a system this unstable survived for so long. Because the story of Russia's monarchs is not simply a line of powerful czars. It is the story of rulers repeatedly strengthening the state only to make more and more of that state depend on the person at the top. For this video, we begin in 1547 with the first ruler formally crowned Tsar of all Rus. Before him, the princes of Moscow had spent generations absorbing rival Russian lands and escaping the political dominance of the Mongol successor states. Ivan III had expanded Muscovy dramatically and presented Moscow as the center of a growing Orthodox state. His grandson would take that claim much further. Ivan IV was 16 when he was crowned Tsar. He is remembered as Ivan the Terrible, but the Russian word attached to his name could also suggest someone fearsome or formidable. Early in his reign, Ivan conquered the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, opening the Volga and pushing Russian power deeper into Eurasia. Administration was reorganized, military service was expanded, and the state grew. Then the reign darkened. Ivan created the Oprichnina, separating part of the realm under his direct control and unleashing a force loyal personally to him. Nobles were dispossessed, suspected enemies were executed, and Novgorod suffered a notorious campaign of terror. At the same time, the long Livonian War drained the state and failed to secure the Baltic coastline Ivan wanted. His succession became another disaster. His eldest surviving son, Ivan, died in 1581 after a confrontation with his father. The famous image of the Tsar killing his son with his own staff is based on later accounts, and the exact circumstances remain debated. What was not debated was the problem left behind. When Ivan the Terrible died in 1584, the throne passed to Fyodor I. Fyodor was deeply religious and far less interested in governing. Much of the practical power moved towards his brother-in-law, Boris Godunov. Then, in 1598, Fyodor died without an heir. The dynasty that had ruled Moscow for centuries was finished. Before we continue, my name is Noah. We built this channel for people who want the full story behind the dynasties, rulers, and turning points that shaped the world we know today. If that sounds like you, subscribe. It is free, and it helps us make better videos more than you might think. All right, back to the Russian throne. Boris Godunov was elected Tsar. He was capable, experienced, and already powerful. But he lacked the one thing previous rulers had inherited automatically: unquestioned dynastic legitimacy. Then harvest failures produced a catastrophic famine. As suffering spread, a man appeared claiming to be Dmitri, the younger son of Ivan the Terrible, who had supposedly died as a child. The claimant gathered support in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and among Russians hostile to Boris. Then something happened that Russian monarchy had spent centuries trying to avoid. The dynasty had run out, and suddenly almost anyone who could gather enough soldiers could claim the throne. Boris died in 1605. His son became Fyodor II. He lasted only weeks before supporters of the pretender seized Moscow and murdered him. The false Dmitri became Tsar. For 11 months, Russia was ruled by a man claiming to be Ivan the Terrible's miraculously surviving son. Then boyars turned against him, killed him, and placed Vasily Shuisky on the throne. Vasily faced rebellion, another false Dmitri, Polish intervention, and an authority that barely extended beyond the forces protecting him. In 1610, Vasily was removed. And then Russia stopped having a Tsar at all. For a time, Moscow was occupied by Polish forces, while Russian elites considered a Polish prince for the throne. But armed resistance reorganized, and in 1612, a national militia helped drive the occupiers from Moscow. 1 year later, an assembly chose a 16-year-old nobleman named Michael Romanov. The time of troubles was over. The Romanov dynasty had begun. Michael's first task was not conquest. It was making Russia governable again. War had devastated towns and farmland. The treasury was weak. Rival states still held Russian territory. Michael restored administration, negotiated peace where possible, and relied heavily on advisors, especially his father Filaret after he became patriarch. His son Alexis inherited a more stable monarchy. Under Alexis, the law code of 1649 strengthened central authority and tied much of the peasantry more firmly to serfdom. Russia also expanded westward during conflicts involving the Cossack uprising in Ukraine and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. But religious reform produced a deep internal rupture. Changes promoted by Patriarch Nikon divided the Orthodox Church and created the Old Believer movement. Alexis's son Fyodor III ruled only 6 years, but attempted administrative and military reforms and abolished an old system that ranked noble families by ancestry for state appointments. When Fyodor died without children in 1682, succession again became dangerous. 2 half-brothers were crowned together. Ivan V was older, but physically frail. Peter was only 10. Their sister Sophia became regent and exercised real power, while the 2 boys shared the title of Tsar. Peter eventually forced Sophia from power. Ivan remained co-Tsar until his death in 1696. Then Peter ruled alone. Until Peter, Russia's monarchs had mainly been trying to secure and expand the state they inherited. Peter wanted to rebuild the state itself. He traveled through Western Europe, studied shipbuilding and military organization, and returned determined to force change from above. The transformation was not gentle. Peter reorganized the army, built a navy, altered elite dress and court culture, changed government institutions, subordinated the church more closely to the state, and demanded enormous taxes and labor from his subjects. He fought Sweden for more than 20 years in the Great Northern War. At Poltava in 1709, the Russian army destroyed the invading force of Charles XII. Russia gained access to the Baltic, and Peter built a new capital, St. Petersburg, on conquered territory. In 1721, he took the title Emperor. The Tsardom of Russia had become the Russian Empire. Peter had transformed Russia into a major European power. His wife became Catherine I after his death in 1725. Real influence rested heavily with powerful court figures, especially Alexander Menshikov. Catherine died 2 years later. And now, the weakness Peter had left behind became impossible to ignore. He had rebuilt the Russian state. He had not created a stable way to choose who inherited it. For the next generation, the throne itself became the battlefield. Peter II, grandson of Peter the Great, became emperor as a child and died of smallpox before his wedding. The throne passed to Anna, daughter of Ivan V. A group of nobles tried to make her accept conditions limiting imperial power. Anna tore up the conditions and restored full autocracy. When she died in 1740, the crown passed to the infant Ivan VI. He was barely old enough to understand that he was emperor before Peter the Great's daughter Elizabeth seized power in a palace coup. Ivan spent most of the rest of his life in prison. Elizabeth ruled for 2 decades, expanded the splendor of the imperial court, supported education and culture, and fought Prussia during the 7 Years' War. Her nephew, Peter III, inherited the throne in 1762. He lasted about 6 months. Peter admired Frederick the Great of Prussia and quickly ended Russia's participation in the war. He also alienated important sections of the court and guards. His wife organized the alternative. Catherine took power in a coup. Peter was arrested and died shortly afterwards in circumstances that remain murky. Catherine II became Catherine the Great. She corresponded with Enlightenment thinkers and presented herself as a reforming ruler. She also depended on the nobility, preserved serfdom, and expanded imperial power relentlessly. Russia annexed Crimea, gained territory around the Black Sea, and participated in the partitions that erased the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth from the map. When the massive Pugachev rebellion shook the empire, Catherine responded with force and became more cautious about social reform. By her death in 1796, Russia was larger, wealthier, and more deeply involved in European politics. Her son Paul inherited an empire built by rulers who had repeatedly manipulated succession. He tried to prevent that from continuing. Paul introduced a clearer hereditary succession law, but his own behavior alienated powerful nobles and officers. In 1801, conspirators entered his palace and killed him. His son Alexander I became emperor. Alexander began with reformist language, then spent much of his reign confronting Napoleon. In 1812, the French emperor invaded Russia with one of the largest armies Europe had seen. Russian armies retreated, Moscow was abandoned, and Napoleon waited for a peace that never came. His army instead began the disastrous retreat west. Russian forces followed the French across Europe, and in 1814, Alexander entered Paris as one of the victorious Allied monarchs. Russia had become one of the central powers deciding Europe's future. Then Alexander died unexpectedly in 1825. The succession was so confused that some officers believed his brother Constantine should rule, even though Constantine had privately renounced his rights. When Nicholas I took the throne, the Decembrist revolt erupted in St. Petersburg. Nicholas crushed it. The experience defined his reign. He defended autocracy, expanded censorship and political policing, and presented Russia as a guardian of conservative order. But the Crimean War exposed military and administrative weaknesses beneath the empire's size. Nicholas died in 1855 while the war was still being fought. His son inherited a simple conclusion. Russia had to change. Alexander II became the great reformer of the late imperial monarchy. In 1861, he emancipated the serfs, legally freeing tens of millions of people from bondage to private landowners. Further reforms transformed courts, local government, education, and the military. But emancipation did not solve the land question, and reform did not eliminate opposition. The Tsar who carried out the greatest social reform of Imperial Russia became the first ruler in this final part of the story killed by a revolutionary bomb. After several failed attempts on his life, members of the People's Will attacked Alexander in St. Petersburg in 1881. One bomb damaged his carriage. Alexander survived and stepped out. A second attacker threw another bomb at close range. The emperor died from his wounds. His son Alexander III drew the opposite lesson from his father's reforms. Instead of opening the political system further, he strengthened autocracy, restricted institutions, and promoted policies of Russification across parts of the empire. Industrial development accelerated, railways expanded, and the state remained externally stable. But political stability had been purchased without solving the basic question Alexander II had exposed. How could a rapidly changing society remain permanently governed by an unlimited monarch? In 1894, Nicholas II inherited that question. He never found an answer. Nicholas believed strongly in preserving autocracy. Meanwhile, Russia was industrializing rapidly. Cities were growing, workers were organizing, revolutionary movements were spreading, and educated elites demanded a political voice. Then Russia went to war with Japan. The defeat was humiliating. In January 1905, peaceful demonstrators marched in St. Petersburg to present a petition to the Tsar. Troops fired on the crowd in the event remembered as Bloody Sunday. Strikes, mutinies, and rebellions spread across the empire. Nicholas responded with the October Manifesto and the creation of the Duma, but he never accepted the idea that parliament should replace imperial authority as the real source of power. The monarchy survived 1905. Then came the First World War. Millions of soldiers were mobilized. Casualties mounted. Transport broke down. Food and fuel shortages worsened in the cities. In 1915, Nicholas took personal command of the army. That decision tied the prestige of the throne directly to every military failure. Back in the capital, Empress Alexandra's reliance on Grigory Rasputin damaged the reputation of the court, whether or not the rumors surrounding him were true. By early 1917, strikes and bread demonstrations in Petrograd turned into revolution. Soldiers refused orders and joined the crowds. The government lost control of the capital. Nicholas tried to return. His train could not reach it. And so we returned to the railway carriage. On March 15th, Nicholas abdicated. His brother Michael declined to take the crown without the approval of a future representative assembly. After centuries of czars and emperors, Russia suddenly had none. Nicholas was already a former emperor when the final tragedy came. In July 1918, Bolshevik guards in Ekaterinburg executed Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, and members of their household. The execution destroyed the family. The abdication had already destroyed the monarchy. Ivan the Terrible had claimed a title that placed one ruler above every rival. Michael Romanov restored that office after civil collapse. Peter transformed the Tsar into an emperor. Catherine expanded the empire. Alexander I helped defeat Napoleon. Nicholas I defended autocracy. Alexander II tried reform. Nicholas II tried to preserve a system that now had to govern industrial cities, mass politics, a modern army, and an empire spanning Eurasia. For centuries, every solution had made the Russian state stronger. But it also made more and more of that state depend on one person at the top. By 1917, the empire had become too complex, too politically divided, and too damaged by war for the old system to survive its failures. The monarchy had built an empire. In the end, the empire outgrew the monarchy.